Greetings and welcome to From the Basement. In this video we're going to take a look at some more advanced techniques for generating terrains. Now admittedly we could do a lot better job than what we're seeing right here, which if we just simply took a little bit more time. If you're not familiar with the scene, this is the scene that I threw together real quick to show trees and detail placement in the previous video. And I spent I think, like maybe a minute throwing together the terrain and the textures. Obviously, we can do a better job than this using the default tools if we just simply take more time. However, to actually get good professional-looking terrain would be an immense time sink trying to use the default tools. There are some tools that we can use for free that will make this task a lot easier. And one of them I'm going to show now is the Terrain Toolkit. You will not find this part of the Unity store. Instead, you have to get it from a Google Code project. If you do a search for a Unity Terrain Toolkit, you'll find the link for it. You can also find a link on the course resource pages as well if you are in one of my classes. To import in a custom package like this that is not part of the asset store, we're going to go to Assets, Import Package, and this time we're going to choose a custom package, and then we need to navigate to where this happens to be. Now for me, that would be in my Unity Terrain Toolkit package there. You could also navigate it to the Explorer and double click on it, drag it into your Unity project. Any way works. So I'm going to open that up. Let's go ahead and import everything. So make sure that you have this imported into your project before continuing on. So if you don't already have this in there, go ahead, pause the video, go find it, download it, get it imported in. Alright, so it's got it imported in. I'm going to go ahead and create a new scene. I'm going to go ahead and save this scene and create a new one. Component, game object, create other terrain, toss a new terrain in there. There we go. And I am for the moment going to leave this as a 2K by 2K terrain, even though I don't particularly want to keep it that way because Terrain Toolkit kind of expects that. I want to show you what its generation looks like with a 2K by 2K terrain, and then what happens when you scratch that down a little bit. Alright, so how we use this is we need to add this component onto our terrain. So making sure my terrain is selected, I'm going to go to Component, Terrain, which you will only see if you have the Terrain Toolkit imported in, Terrain Toolkit. And this will add another component into our inspector here. Now we've got Create, Erode, and Texture. Let's take a look at Create first. We have got a couple of different create options here, Verone, Fractal, and Perlin. Perlin usually being the best random generation method. And I'm going to tell it to generate rough planes. It's going to set some features here. I'm going to click on Generate, and boom, I have rough planes. And just like that, now I now have a rather large terrain that I could have a player explore through. And the amount of work it would take to get this level of detail by hand would be insane. It would take you a while to do that. And I could just continually click on Generate until I find the terrain that I wish to work with. Of course, I can change this. Maybe I want rolling hills. Oops. Generate. And now I've got rolling hills, or maybe I want rocky mountains. I'm not entirely sure why they added in this hellish landscape option here, because as you can see, yeah, it's you're not going to be able to walk on that. I mean, seriously. And if we zoom in here, this is roughly where the character would be standing, and yeah, you're not going anywhere in this. Now you can tweak these settings. Frequency, of course, determines how many of these bumps you have. So if we pull this frequency down to 4 and generate, you notice it's got less. Octaves as well. If I pull this down, we can see now that it's very smooth. Bringing it up makes it more jagged. The amplitude, if I pull this down, really controls how wavy it is. So I can use this to slowly increase how wavy it is. And then blend, how well is it blended in with other areas. Generally, I leave blend at 1. It doesn't give you too much of a difference playing around with blend. Now, another option is to add noise. If I come down here to add noise and generate, you notice the overall shape didn't change. It's just adding noise to the shape that I did have. So now I've got a really rough, jagged looking terrain. If I come down here to where a player might be, and see it looks really rough. Of course, I can undo that by going to smooth. Now smooth is really awesome because it applies the smoothing to the entire terrain at once, as opposed to, say, taking the smooth tool, cranking my brush size up to maximum, and then trying to paint over the entire terrain. Instead of having to do that, I can just come down here to my smooth tool and say, okay, you know what? I want 3 iterations of smoothing. Boom. There we go. The whole thing is smoothed out. Now, normalize is an interesting one. Normalizing is for dealing with height variances. And to really show this one off, I am going to now switch to a 400 by 400 sized area. So I'm going to go to my properties. I'm going to go to 400 by 400. Of course, I'm going to immediately lose track of where it is. Double click on that, bring it back. Oops, didn't quite get that. There we go. And of course, take the long flight back in. And you can see once I scrunched it down like that, all of a sudden, it's turned into this jagged, unwalkable area. That's because I've got the same, it's kind of like taking it and stretching it. When it was at 2000 by 2000, I had all of those lumps and peaks stretched out over a greater distance. Now that I've squished everything back together, it's got to keep the same height difference, but in a much shorter range, a much shorter distance, and so everything becomes spikier and stuff. So what I can do is I can come here to normalize and say, okay, well, normally, what is my max height, my minimum and my max, 0 to 1. Well, if I, say, scrunch this down to a quarter, 0.25, normalize, basically it took that terrain and scrunched it down. So you notice now it's a little bit more flat. And I could, normalize it even further, bringing that difference down. So whereas before my range was 0 to 1, now it's like from 1 to 2.5. And I could even normalize it down to the point where I've got almost a flat terrain again. And generally speaking, if you're dealing with small sizes, you need to deal with the normalize. So if I go to create and purl in and try to generate, boom, I'm right straight back to the jaggies. And of course I can try to deal with this by tweaking my settings here. So octaves, maybe we can pull that down, pull my amplitude down, pull frequency down a lot. But it's still going to be pretty jagged. You notice I've got everything almost completely scrunched down to the minimum settings that it can have, and it's still really jagged. So I'm still going to have to either come over here to smooth and try and smooth things out, or come here to normalize and try to normalize down that distance. Or I can also come in and say, okay, well, now that I've got roughly the shape that I want, I can start sculpting this. So maybe I want to even out a valley here where the actual adventure is going to take place, and I can leave the rest of this as mountains. And maybe come over to Perlin, add some noise back in. Oops, and remember to actually adjust my settings here. Oh, yeah, that's right. Add noise you can't really use when you're on the small one. In any case, now I can come through here and, oops, Control Z. Where? Oh, my opacity is like insane. That's why. And so now I can use this tool to come through here and add in a little bit of texture to this floor area here. Oops. And then maybe come back here and do a single, maybe 2 smooth passes, so that I've got some variation in that floor area, but it isn't jagged. Okay, so that takes care of just the basics of the create. Now there's a lot of playing around and tweaking that you need to just figure out to get to a good starting point. Keep in mind, a procedurally generated terrain is never going to be the final terrain. You're always going to want to go back in and try and tweak and manipulate it to get what you really, really want and need. The road tools are kind of fun to mess around with. They pretty much sound like, they do what they sound. I can talk, I promise. It does what it sounds like it does. It erodes the terrain. Now, be warned, this can really take some time. For example, I can come here and say, when rain swept earth, maybe I'll do a fast on this, and do apply hydraulic erosion. Ahem. And you can see now that it has eroded the terrain, adding in some additional detail. The kind of detail that you might see for, again, water erosion. Adding a little bit more realism to the terrain. I'm not going to go over all of the erode tools. Those really just sort of take time playing with them, seeing how it works, seeing what it does to get a good feel for how those tools work. But the final tool I want to go over is the texture tool, because this one's a little bit annoying to use properly. So first of all, I'm going to add in a texture. Now this is a little bit different. The first texture we add in is still considered to be our default texture that's applied to everything. But when I do the procedural texture, this is going to be my cliff texture. So I'm going to add in another texture. So cliff, I'm going to select, and I'm going to search for one of those cliffs again. Let's go with cliff flayed rock. And let's go for grass on this other one. And now that I have 2 textures, I can say apply procedural texture. And at first, everything's going to be all grass except for this one little lone patch of rock over here. That's because I need to adjust my slope here. So my cliffs start at a 60-degree slope and they end at a 75-degree slope. So I don't even start fading in my cliff texture until I have a 60-degree slope, which is pretty steep. So if I say change this to 35 and then hit apply texture, you can notice I'm starting to get some more fade-ins in places. And if I lower this, this is where it becomes full on. So maybe I lower this down to 50, apply procedural. Now those areas have gotten a lot sharper. There's also not as much fade in area. So maybe I want to lower this down to 25. And that gives me a little bit more of a blended look. Maybe increase this one to 55. Fade some of those edges a little bit. And again, this isn't going to be good enough to just say click the button and leave it as is, but it's a good starting point. That's a lot of detail work. To do this by hand would have taken a lot of time, especially with how persnickety the texture brush happens to be. Now we can even go one step further and paint down textures based on height. So I'm going to add in a new texture here. Actually, I'm going to set this one to grass. I am going to set my old texture to dirt because this first one is the low texture. This is the next highest texture. And I'm going to add one more. And let's go for a grass and rock texture. So if I hit apply procedural now, everything's going to be dirt. And this is one spot where I kind of wish the toolkit didn't use 0 to 1 for its values. Instead, it would use the actual height values of the terrain. But, yeah, what can you do? It's a free tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Paint to Height tool, and I'm going to shift-click to find out what my height is here. It's 88.7. Now, my maximum height is 600. So if I bring up my calculator and do, what was that, 88.7 divided by 600, I get 0.147. Let's do 0.148. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to say that this ends at 0.1, let's say 5. Let's see what happens if I do that. If I do apply procedural, well, that becomes, you can kind of sort of see some fading in there, but not quite very good. So now let's take a look maybe at this point right here. Come back over here to this tool, shift click to get it. That's 92.5. So come back over here. I've got 92.5 divided by 600. That gives me 0.154. So let's do 0.16. Or actually, let's do 5.1 for our start of the new texture, and 0.16 for our end, and the start of texture 3 will be 0.17. Now if I do apply procedural, it's a little bit tight on the banding, but we can sort of, we can see we've got the dirt here. It very quickly blurs into the grass. And I could fix this by perhaps, say, stretching this out a little bit so it starts at 1.55. Apply procedural. Notice it fades up now a little bit. And I could say that it ends at 0.7, and this starts at 0.85. Apply. And now I get a little bit more of a fade going into things. And so you can see now this gives us a really good starting point. Or maybe this is a lake. Maybe this isn't an actual walk area. Maybe this is the lake here that we want to have going. And so by using this tool, we can very rapidly get to a good starting point. 18 minutes in, and I'm having to explain things as I go along, and I've got something that looks 1,000 times better than what I had in the previous videos. Definitely not done. I definitely, at this point, you would want to go through and, paint on, we probably need a little bit more rock right here. So we'd go back to our regular paint tools and try and paint that on a little bit. Oops, make sure I'm actually on the right tool here. Now maybe we want the rock to go down a little bit further in on a couple spots. Or maybe this particular hill here is a little bit grassier than the rest of them. So on and so forth. Maybe I just want to make that rock a little bit more grassy there. You get the idea. Now it's important to note that you need to leave the detailing again as the very last step, because if for whatever reason you need to come back here and hit apply procedural texture again, it will erase all of the changes that you made. Again, just sort of as a deeper demonstration, color in a nice big patch of rock here. I hit apply procedural texture and it's gone. So be aware of that. And that pretty much covers the Terrain Toolkit. It's a very useful thing. I highly recommend you go out and download that from the Google Code project. It can really speed things up. Now there's definitely some add-ons from the Unity Asset Store that can do this kind of stuff and a heck of a lot more. They tend to be a lot more complicated, and in the case of the best one, also costs $90 to buy. So, Terrain Toolkit, it works great, it's fairly simple, and it's free to use. So that's the reason why I recommend it, at least in these videos. But by no means is it perfect, and there's definitely better options on the store if you're willing to pay for them and to go through the higher learning curve. And with that, that concludes this video.